Let's applaud all of these wonderful people who catered this delicious meal for us tonight. Thank you. Dr. Joy Jordan Lake is a professor at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee, and she's the author of Blue Hole Back Home, a novel, which won the 2009 National Christie Award for First Novel and was selected as a 2009 Common Book for Baylor University. It's inspired by actual events from Joy's own teenage years, and she explores the tensions and eventual violence that erupt in a small, all-white Appalachian town when a Sri Lankan family moves in. Ultimately, Blue Back Home is a story not only of the devastating effects of racial hatred and cowardice, but more centrally, a celebration of courage, confrontation, and healing. Blue Hole Back Home is often chosen as classroom and summer reading at various public and private high school, middle schools, colleges, and universities. Other publications by Dr. Jordan Lake include Grit and Grace, Portraits of a Woman's Life, Whitewashing Uncle Tom's Cabin, 19th Century Women Novelists Respond to Stowe, and Why Jesus Makes Me Nervous, 10 Alarming Words of Faith. In addition to reading your work, Joy, I delight in your blog, Writing in the Midst of Real Life. It's an inspiring sight. Let's welcome Joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here. And let me ask, if I have a tendency, Vi and I were just discussing to begin, but I blame it on my years living in Boston. When I get excited, I begin to talk too fast. So do me a favor, if at any point you can't hear me, just wave a little hand and I'll try my best to slow down and maybe kick back into my Tennessee twang or something. Maybe that'll slow me down a little bit. Thank you so much for having me, and I want to thank Vi especially. A year and a half ago was headed here and so excited about getting to come to Eastern Mennonite University, and had a family emergency on top of a crisis on top of a disaster, pretty much. And Vi was just as gracious and compassionate a person as you could ever want to deal with, and it was just an amazing time that felt like one of those God connections that she was a friend I had never met before. And so I'm sure there was all sorts of inconvenience and embarrassment and disruption. And I just wanted to say a public thank you for that grace and compassion that was offered. And it's good to be a year and a half down the road and be able to stand here and say that God can bring tremendous beauty out of ashes. So I've just learned in my life, having been a minister for a few years ago when I was a bit younger person, being a college professor, being someone who teaches creative writing, too, where people tend to open up their lives quite authentically and honestly. And I've come to realize that most of us are dealing with a lot more at any given time than we look like we are. We know how to put on a good face and smile for the camera. And so I just making the assumption that all of us in this room are probably dealing with a little more stress or a little more turmoil or a little more mystery or sadness or whatever in our lives than we look like we are. I'd like you to turn to each other very briefly, please, and just say, given what you've been dealing with lately, you don't look half bad. Turn to anybody at your table if you'd like. A couple of people are fine. It's fun to get to watch from up here, too, and watch faces looking like, how did you know? How did you know the sky just fell? I've entitled this talk, Back Home and Beecher and Blue Ridge, which I realize makes absolutely no sense to you at this moment, I realize, but let me apologize simply by saying I was raised Baptist, and Baptists are bad at a lot of things. Baptists tend to be, I don't know, often mean-spirited and narrow-minded, but we're very good at alliteration. And it becomes this kind of incurable thing when you grow up with it. You can't stop yourself. So there you go. We're most Baptists I know, the more progressive Baptists, which I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking that is a contradiction in terms, but there are a couple on the planet. We most of us, I will tell you right now, and this is not just flattery because I'm here at EMU, it's the honest truth that most Baptists on the more progressive end of the spectrum really want to be Mennonites when we grow up. That's kind of weird. That's just who we are. You know, it's like those people over there who are all about peace and justice and compassion, and we're over here trying to explain. We are good, however, though, I must say, watching people be raised Baptist like I was, it's sort of from the time a baby can first lift its head, they begin to have to learn to flip through the Bible very quickly. The sword drills start in the cradle, and you kind of, so it's, mean-spirited and narrow-minded, but man, we can find Habakkuk faster than anybody in the room. Before you can say Jeremiah was a bullfrog, we can find that Bible passage. But Vi had mentioned that several writers who have come to this kind of event talk often about what's behind the stories that they write. And that's something I always love to hear, too, from writers. I love to know the stories behind the stories. What inspired this? Or what on earth made you come up with that character? Is that based on real life? What's behind that? How much is historical? How much is your imagination? What was going on? I love to hear those stories too. And I'm assuming if you're at this event, it's because you're someone who loves stories, that perhaps you are an avid reader, perhaps you're a gifted writer yourself, perhaps you're a teacher of literature or writing or both. And we're a club. We're a little odd to the rest of the world. The way we love words and we love stories. So it's a privilege to get to be together and get to be odd together. I'm thinking especially coming here a year and a half after things seemed so dark in my life and just seemed to be ashes all around. I'm reminded, both in terms of thinking about the stories behind Blue Hole, but just the stories in my life that have contributed to my learning about hope. And I love nothing more than one of my favorite things about getting to be in college communities or be with groups of writers is trading stories with people. And I regret that there's only one mic up here because I love trading. Stories engender more stories. And that's one thing I love about when you write something, and you've probably had this happen, many of you put a story out there and you get stories back. And it's such an honor to hear other people's stories of what inspires them and what fires their creative juices. I think this particular book, it wasn't the first book I wrote, but it was the first novel. And I think it probably never would have come to be if I hadn't actually been living in New England at the time. Do we have anybody here who's maybe lived in New England? Yay! Or anyone who's been to Boston and loved it, perhaps? Wonderful city, one of the great cities of the world, the hub of the universe, Bostonians like to think of themselves. It was living there. I loved living in Boston, but I always felt a bit like a stranger in a strange land. I had been raised in the mountains of East Tennessee, these very same mountains just trickling a little, getting a little smaller and trickling southward. And Boston was for me a place where I always felt foreign, even as much as I loved it. On one particular trip to the Shenandoah Valley, my husband and I were co-officiating in a wedding of some young friends, and we were driving through going down 81 and got off the road and were winding through some of the darling small towns somewhere near Lexington. And I was really kind of missing these mountains so much and wondering, and we passed a little side of the road place that had a marquee out front. And the marquee, I kid you not, said, "Fresh bait, cold beer, Jesus saves." And my husband and I turned to each other and he said, "Okay, if you can't write a novel around that, there's really no hope for you." So that was part of the inspiration. The novel Blue Hole, as Vi said, based, or at least inspired and partially based on some historical events in Tennessee and Mississippi. I set it in North Carolina, and I will tell you that was out of sheer cowardice. And the fact that I wanted to go back to the best barbecue joint in the world in my hometown and not have my picture with a big red circle and a line through it. So I thought if I set it in the North Carolina mountains instead of the East Tennessee mountains, it wouldn't be so incredibly obvious that I was writing about my hometown, and it fooled absolutely no one for absolutely no time at all. My brother called me up immediately and said, "I know who every character in the novel is." And I said, no, they're fictionalized. They're not real people. No, I know who they all are. Draw those lines, put the names on them. I think I I don't know that I'd ever really thought of myself as a Southerner until moving to Boston. And everywhere I went, it smacked me in the face, whether I wanted it to or not. My husband was raised very low income in LA by a very valiant single mom. He is not a product of Ivy League blue blood culture. But he did go to Harvard on scholarship and made lots of blue-blooded Brahmin friends. And so when I moved up with my little cut-off jean shorts and my Tennessee twang, he was trying to introduce me to these friends who sort of talked like this. And they all had names like Cornelia and Mortimer and Hancock, Adams, Peabody, the fourth. It was always at least the fourth, if not the 14th. And here I was, and this was before either one of us were used to the whole married name and what do you do with that. And so my Joy Jordan had always been a difficult name anyway. People always said it sounded like a bouncing ball, Joy Jordan, Joy Jordan, Joy Jordan. And so that was always a pain anyway. And then Joy Lake, for both of us, to me, I conjure in images of sort of a sleazy adult resort or a toxic waste site. It just didn't work. But this was before I hyphenated my name finally, out of just desperation. But he would introduce me, and here I was with this accent and Joy Lake, this name, and their eyes would get huge, and they would say, not "where are you from," but with my heavy Tennessee twang at the time, they would say, "Where in the South are you from?" And, I have to tell you, you all sometimes may feel a little discriminated against if you're, from a smaller city in Virginia, but the truth is most people in our country, I think, view Virginians as sophisticated. It's the cradle of the presidency. It's you've got lots of wonderful institutions of higher education. Whereas Tennessee, it's just moonshine stills, tar paper shacks, and monster truck pulls, and a lot of Baptist preachers. That's pretty much what we have to offer the world. And you could see it on their faces. I would say, "Hi, I'm from Tennessee." And they would just, they would say, "How interesting." But you could tell what they were thinking was, "I am so sorry for your affliction, that this happened to you." And then they would kind of pull themselves together and they would say, "Well, what brings someone from Tennessee to Boston?" And I would say, it took me a long time to learn to pronounce it correctly. At that time, I would make about 3 or 4 syllables out of it, but it was Boston. I can't even say it anymore. But I would say I'm here going to graduate school. I'm going to get a doctorate in English literature. And they would look at each other, and you could just tell it was Mortimer, it's a Southerner who can read. And it just could not believe it. But I think partly I just got so tired of defending that, yes, I can read, and I have read more than one book even, and trying to always, in the face of kind of these images of Gomer Pyle and, yada, 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 and then the old newsreels, Bull O'Connor. And so I went on my own personal PR campaign for the entire New South. And to hear me tell it, it was, the New South. Everyone else, they needed to wake up and smell the sweet tea, that it was this new place. It was where, to hear me tell it, it was the hub of racial harmony and goodness and excellent barbecue and great banjo music. And, all of God's goodness was basically centered, interestingly enough, in my hometown, Signal Mountain, Tennessee. So I was always in graduate school in Boston. I was always telling stories about Signal Mountain, Tennessee, the hub of all sunshine, flowers, good music, and good food. And it was always on. And I think I actually had a few converts along the way who were they'd never actually been south of New York City, but they were beginning to be open to the idea at some point in their lives that they might not actually just be, slaughtered at the Mason-Dixon line. And one night, a bunch of us had gone to see a movie that had just come out in Copley Square in Boston. And everyone there was from New England, with the exception of my husband, who's from L.A., who has the same opinion about the South, the whole, the newsreels and the Gomer Pyle and all of us sitting in the row. And I had done my good PR work for months and months. And we're watching this new movie that's come out called Ghost of Mississippi. And I'm sitting there thinking, what a shame Mississippi is so benighted. What a shame. Boy, am I glad I'm not from Mississippi. We're watching. And there's one scene, if you haven't seen the movie, by all means, see it. There's one scene where the assistant DA, DeLauder, is trying to convict in the 90s, trying to finally bring back to trial 30 years after the fact, a guy named Byron de la Beckwith. If you remember this story, lots of us in this room are old enough to remember, he's the one who shot a civil rights hero in cold blood, Medgar Evers. His fingerprints were on the rifle. He was drunk one night and bragged about shooting him a few nights after it happened, on and on and on. But in the 60s, an all-white jury let him off twice, okay? So 30 years later, he's coming back to trial, thanks to a valiant newspaper reporter and some other folks, especially Myrlie Evers, Medgar's widow, who would not give up her hope that maybe the American justice system had some good in it yet. So 30 years after the fact, they're bringing this back to trial. And James Woods, I believe, is the one playing Byron de la Beckwith. And you see the assistant DA washing his hands, and then here it comes, Byron de la Beckwith's face, James Woods, over his shoulder, kind of sneering like this. And he says, if you think that even now 12 people in Mississippi are going to convict a white man of a black man's death, he didn't say black man, of a black man's death, you've got another thing coming. He said, just give me a few more days of this trial, and I'm going to be free as a bird, living in peace and prosperity back in my home on Signal Mountain, Tennessee. Well, my whole row just froze. And they all lean forward and look at me like, so you forgot to mention that small detail that the assassin of a civil rights hero was comfortably living in your hometown. You forgot that small detail. This was the first I had ever heard of this. Hollywood had to tell me. I go home and call up everybody I know my age from my town saying, did you have any idea? Not a one of them knew this. The entire time we were growing up, this man lived on the backside of our little mountain. Not a big place. Most people knew everybody there. We began to ask our parents. Some of them did know, were horrified. The man had been acquitted. What can you do? There he lives with his giant Confederate flag hanging off his porch. But it wasn't talked about. No one talked about it. Those who were horrified were ashamed and didn't talk about it. And some people just wanted to be nice and didn't talk about it. And we never knew. Well, that so rocked me back on my heels that this little town that I thought of as just such a nurturing, such a good place to grow up, where people were so kind to each other. How is it that a man like that could be harbored and no one talks about it? And I began to just pay more attention to my own life and to the stories all around me. And I began to think about the stories that had begun making me who I was. My very first childhood memory of all, my family and I were living in Washington, D.C., right in the heart of the city. And in my family, I was about 5 years old at the time, and my family did not ever watch daytime TV. It was an 11th commandment, and thou shalt not. It was never on. It was right up there with adultery and stealing and just right, thou shalt not. And the television was on in the middle of the day one day, I remember. Walked in, and not only is the television on, my mother is just crumpled in the middle of the living room floor, and she's holding herself, and she's rocking back and forth, just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing. And I didn't really understand what had happened, but I knew that whatever it was horrific. And this was the first memory emblazoned. And Martin Luther King Jr. had just been shot, or had been shot. Was just watching the news all day, just watching and just sobbing and sobbing. And this was a woman raised in Alabama and Atlanta, born in the mid-1930s, good Southern white girl. And that was a story for me about what breaks the heart of God and what ought to break our hearts. One of my first memories. And growing up on lovely Signal Mountain, Tennessee, one of the memories I guess I hadn't thought a lot about until trying to review this sweet little town was the one time when we'd been out swimming at the lake on the backside of the road, and we were coming home. And I was in the back seat, my parents were in the front seat, and we were stopped by these orange and white barrels across the road. This weird roadblock in the middle of nowhere, and these men come and surround our car, all in white sheets and white hoods. And there was a Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket that one was holding, and rifles in every hand. And they took the rifles and they banged on the window. Please roll down your window. My dad rolled down the window. They stuck the rifle in and the Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket in and said, "Would you like to donate to the Klan?" And I remember as a child being afraid. And I remember they were starting to rock our car, like they were going to flip it over if we didn't donate. And I remember being afraid, but I also remember this. My father was not a perfect parent. And I don't know if you're a parent or not, but I know I'm a far from perfect parent. But one of the great gifts he gave me was, in that moment, I do remember being afraid, but not nearly as afraid as I would have been if I had known what he would say. And I knew what he would say, and I knew it might get us in yet more trouble. But there was a certain comfort in knowing for sure what my father would say. He leans out and says, "No." And I remember thinking, okay, now's when we die. Pretty clear to me. But it's interesting to look back and realize that story was a great gift to me, that comfort in knowing what my father was going to say. When I was a teenager, one guy from my high school and then two other guys. They were a bit older than my brother and me, but one of them did actually play football with my brother, and here's the kind of guy he was. He came into football practice one day, and my brother was just a sophomore, I think, and this guy was a big, hulking senior. He came in, picks up my brother, who was bench pressing at the time, picks up my brother, who's 6'2", bench press or lifts him like this over his head, and then hurls my brother just because he was a sophomore. That's the kind of guy he was. Well, he was drunk one night in 1980, along with two of his buddies, and they had guns with them, and they were driving down the streets of Chattanooga, and went to a predominantly African American part of town and just began to randomly shoot on the side of the road, and critically injured 5 African American women. When it came to trial, 2 of the guys got off completely scot-free. Not a fine, not a day in jail. One of them spent 9 months in jail. Well, Chattanooga went crazy. There were riots. And I can remember standing up on Little Signal Mountain and looking down in Chattanooga and watching fires and feeling like I kind of wanted to go light a fire too. I just feeling like, how is this justice? What's wrong with the world? What's wrong with our justice system? And that's around that same time period, a family from Sri Lanka moved to town. Delightful family. They had a daughter about my age, and we became friends. And everyone else in this town at this point, it was an all-white town, as Vi mentioned, and everybody was pretty much Protestant with a few, little small community of Catholics, and that was about it. And here comes this formerly Muslim family moving to town, and my friend was just this gorgeous young woman, and as she and I began to kind of hang out, and she actually became coming to church with me. Her father apparently had decided, let's do as the Romans do. Let's fit in here. Let's assimilate. And she was embraced by our community. There's still some good old Polaroid snapshots floating around of her actual name was Shyama, at the center of this big group of white kids and youth choir. And here she is, this gorgeous person in the middle, beaming. But some turmoil began to stir, and without going into detail, at one point the Klan threatened her family, blew up their car, threw rocks through their windows, and burned a cross in their front yard, and scared them to death, as you might imagine. And my dad and I went over, and Shyama stood in the front yard. The last time I saw her, she stood in the front yard with me and looked me in the eye and said, my father always said that America was the end of the rainbow, and that coming here would be golden. Explain this to me. And I tell you, I think the reason I had to write the book was I don't remember what I said. And that horrifies me. I remember standing there, 16, 17 years old, and wishing that I could explain this, and wishing I had beautiful words that would make it okay, and wishing I could do anything to say, you know what, stay on. These crazy people don't mean it. They won't really hurt you. They're the exception. Make it all okay with whatever my beautiful word. I don't remember what I said. I just remember babbling, and I'm sure they were muddled and ineffective. And but I'm haunted that the last time I saw her was that interaction. And we were close enough friends that in any other case, we would have exchanged letters and addresses and maybe gone to see each other. And there was no communication after that. I think we were so utterly horrified, and there were no words. And I've been haunted by that all those years. So again, I wanted to put an ending in a way to the story, or at least pull the story along and see if I couldn't in some way try to begin to explain it to myself. How does this sweet town, with all these people who would happily run into the middle of a fire for another person to pull out something or someone who was valuable, how in this sweet little town could evil of that magnitude also coexist? When I was working on my, trying to write my first novel, which wasn't published before this one, which I hope finally, after 15 years, will come around to being published soon. I was inspired by some of the research that started out for the novel and became a doctoral dissertation. Some of you all know that strange road, by the story of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her writing life. And some of you all may know this. But it's always helped me, both as a lover of literature and a teacher of literature and someone who tries to write. And many of you in this room probably fit all those categories too. But Harriet Beecher Stowe, here she's the mother of 6. She has no time. She's a writer of sentimental romances, nothing that's ever made much money, certainly not fame. Now and then buys a new coat for a kid if she's fortunate, but sort of silly stories they're viewed as, and yet she has this great passion to make the world a different place. She's passionately anti-slavery, and she wishes that she'd been born a man because then she could be a preacher like her husband and her brother and her father. But instead, she said, I had to use a paper pulpit. I had to figure out how to make my pen and my paper my pulpit. And her sister-in-law at one point challenged her and said, Harriet, if I had your gift of writing, I would do something about this wicked issue of slavery. And the story goes that Harriet, sitting by the fire with her children, stands to her feet and says, if I live, I will do it. She was a person at that point of fragile health. She was alone with her husband traveling at one point when her baby Charlie got very ill, and he actually died in her arms while her husband was still away. And she wrote to her husband to tell him what had happened, and she said, I'm so overcome with grief. I really don't think I can go on unless I can cling to the hope that God will somehow bring some sort of good out of this grief that has so flooded me. And she began to think, as she relived over and over her own baby dying in her arms and being completely powerless to do anything about it, she began to think about slave moms on the auction block having their children torn from them, and began to feel at just the bone level what that might feel like. And she begins to write story by story, installation by installation. She was also taking communion at one point in her church and has this vision of a dark-skinned man like this being whipped to death. And that became, as she began to write, became the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin that changed the course of history, became the best-selling book besides the Bible to that point in American literature, and many would say rocked hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe who knows, people, senators, leaders of this country from being, it's not my problem, I live in the North, it's not my problem, it's not something I'm going to get exercised about myself, to suddenly they were emotionally involved too. They had to be part of the answer too. Suddenly they had to be involved with this issue of slavery just by telling her story, part imagination, part based on fact. There's a story in my family, again, that's been disturbing to me that has been part of this next book. And I bet you have stories in your family that maybe need telling as well. So I challenge you to think through some of those. One of the stories in my family that's been handed down mother to daughter as a gift of empowerment is how it's been meant. But it's about my great, sixth greats grandmother in Alabama who had 9 children. Her husband goes off to the Civil War and he's killed. She has never so much, the story goes, as brushed her own hair. She has 9 children and a farm, and everyone's gone. And the story goes that when she was an old woman, one of her grandkids looked up at her and said, Granny, that sampler behind you that you stitched that says God will provide, do you believe that? And this great-grandmother said, Sonny, I not only believe it, I have lived it. And it was told as this beautiful story, mother to daughter, about here's what it is to be a woman in our family. You rely on God. You're going to be stronger than you know. Look to God, and you'll have more strength than you can possibly imagine. But I remember the day when it occurred to me how horrific the story was, that this woman had never so much as brushed her own hair because she owned slaves. No one called it that in this progressive, politically progressive family of mine. It was a farm. But that was the story behind the story, and it's a chilling one, of this white woman who'd never brushed her own hair, and of the story of God will provide, and wondering, so what about the women who brushed her hair? What happened to them and their daughters? What a story are they telling mother to daughter, mother to daughter? So those kind of stories that are disturbing, and yet stories, if we learn from them, stories of grief, a story of ugly looks at ourselves or our families or our past or our towns, that can also be turned into stories of power and stories of hope. I want to encourage you, just because not everyone who is of a creative bent is also low on self-esteem, but I will tell you, I think most are. I think most people who love to write are often crippled by feeling like this probably isn't very good, and often paralyzed with these voices that go off in your head saying, who are you kidding? Why are you deluding yourself? Go out and do something useful. And especially if you're a compassionate person, if you're an activist, wouldn't it be better to spend all your time serving at the soup kitchen? Go do something that's truly worthwhile, that truly, truly is worthwhile. Why would you sit around, read stories, and write stories? Go quit kidding yourself. You're not adding anything to the world. And if you're like me, you need to hear those other stories too, that there is value and there's power in stories. And need to find places where you're affirmed for your gift and your love of stories, whether it's writing them or reading them or both. One of my favorite stories from Flannery O'Connor is when she was at a woman's tea, everybody in white gloves and hats, and she gets up to talk about her writing, which is a little bizarre for this group of ladies in gloves and hats anyway. And she says, that she begins to take questions, and one sweet little lady says, Miss O'Connor, why do you write? And Flannery O'Connor apparently kicked back on her heels and said, well, because I'm good at it. Which is a story I love to tell and love to hear, because that's something for a lot of us, including me, very hard to say, very hard to embrace. But I just want to encourage you, both as individuals and as a community. I love getting to read about this university on the website. Love to get to see what you say about yourselves, the words of peace and hope and justice and service and community. Just those rich and powerful and very dangerous words. It's quite a beautiful thing. So I guess I just want to end by just saying I just hope that this will always be, as it seems to be now, a place where stories are valued, and whether it's the narrative arc of a 19th century novel, whether it's the plot of a play, whether it's the history, the languages that you study, the words you trade over coffee at the campus center. I would just want to encourage you to keep telling your stories, keep listening to the stories around you, keep paying attention to the stories from your childhood, from your teen years, from your background, from your town. What can be learned from them? Who can you change? What hope is there? What grief is there that needs to be observed? What ugliness needs to be acknowledged? What grief needs to be dealt with? But also, how can we hold that tension of the I'm good at, along with I have so much to learn? And how can we continue to encourage each other to be people who aren't afraid to change and to be changed by the power of stories? So thanks so much for having me. And let me ask you questions. I would love to answer any questions if you have any. Yes?
Why did you know your father would say no to the Ku Klux Klan?
That's who he was. a very shy person, very introverted. He was a minister, and it about killed him, having to be a public person a lot. But down underneath all that shyness was a rock solid. He was someone who early on left the South because he was so heartbroken over in the 30s, 40s. He left in the 50s and moved to New England for a while because of the racial situation in the South. And then I think decided he needed to go back and be part of a change. But a very quiet person, but willing to speak out when it was time to speak out. And thanks for asking. Yes.
A number of us here are in the middle of Blue Hole.
Oh, good.
Is there any part of that country you would be from?
Yes. Yes. I will try my best to resurrect that Tennessee twang. And here's what kills me. I don't know if any of you all have had a Southern accent yourself enough to know the difference when you hear a bad one in a movie or a TV show and you just, fingernails down the. And here's the tragic thing is, so now I have a phony Southern accent. Or at least it sounds phony to my ear, but I'll try my best to resurrect the twang. Thanks for asking. This first story is backstitching time. Likely it was only two dreams crisscrossing paths, one snagging on the other and passing, but somehow the face that walked by me this morning, not 4 feet away, got tangled up with one from my past. The way back and way far away, all quiet and almost forgotten, got yanked up and placed alongside today, where 2 minutes before I'd have told you I was, in Boston, at the Public Garden, not a stone's throw from Beacon Hill where I live and work and pay as much for my own private parking space as folks back home do for a decent slab ranch and enough acres for the dogs to tree themselves something other than city soft squirrel. I was cozied up on a park bench in the garden to cool my espresso and pry off the pumps that I despise and I wear every day. Then the face passed by my bench. I lurched forward to stare, then back to cover for staring, and splashed espresso clear down my front. And I swear time backstitched on itself. And at that very moment, I was barefoot, not with black pumps stowed under a park bench, but the right kind of barefoot. The kind of barefoot that went with the truck bed of a pickup. I was back with the wind standing my ponytail straight up over my head, the blue hole just around the next curve. And I was tracing my cheek where a kiss had just landed. So there I sat in the garden this morning, tracing my cheek, feeling my heart seize up in my chest and that ache stabbing down to my toes, and my toes going cold in the wind off the truck. In that moment, the smell of espresso got overpowered by the scents of my past, pine needles and boy sweat, salted peanuts and Coke. I heard bluegrass, guitar, and banjo all mixed up with rhythm and blues, and a rope swing ticking forward and back, keeping time. I was barefoot in the back of a pickup, believing that it was love that makes people brave and gorgeous and clever and kind. Believing and being wrong. I haven't often or ever actually told the story of that summer because its beginning, when the new girl lifted her brown legs up over our tailgate, never connected up with the end, with the goodness or the fire. Brown was what that leg was back at the beginning, and not just tanned in the dark. It was me who'd said we should stop for her, and me who knew first that our troubles had just dug in deep, a fat tick way down into fur. Now, plenty of folks said what happened that summer was my doing, and plenty said it was all Jimbo's fault, but I'm saying it was the fault of the blue hole. All sunk sweet and sacred is what Jimbo called the blue hole back then. The son of the First Baptist Church preacher, a kind of little league pope in a small southern town. Jimbo handled words like electrical wires he might just dip into water. And though he favored the peculiar or crude, he'd often come up with something like that, musty old word like sacred, make us all jump. Sacred's not a word I've ever much liked. It says to me bad organ music that's less to stop open, and sopranos with skin like cheap parlor drapes hung from their jaws. But maybe some things and some places just are sacred. And maybe the Blue Hole was one of those places, even more so perhaps after that one August night when the men in white bed sheets paid house calls all over Pisgah Ridge and made sure we all understood that although times had supposedly changed, some kinds of thinking and some kinds of hate had not. It was the men in the white bed sheets that changed us, them in the Blue Hole that changed us forever. Now, I've learned not to speak of those things to folks here in Boston, especially the men that I date. Early on, before I'd learned better than to talk of back home, they would fumble their lobster forks into their chowder. How old must you be? They would ask, the ones whose mamas must not have harped much on manners. Like living through one race of people not being real kind to another takes a whole lot of age. Sometimes, inside the main course, I might try to explain George Wallace, the before and the after repentance. Was that what he called it? And Reconstruction and Rosewood. Then they had to know, why did I think Huey Long got himself shot and Strom Thurmond didn't? So I generally don't talk much of the past anymore, my own or the South's. I don't stamp myself with stories that might limit my shelf life, making me sound even older than these Boston winters already have made me look. I rarely refer to Carolina at all, or to the mountains, or to my little town on the Blue Ridge. If I mention the Blue Hole, it's only in passing, and I take care to skirt real far around the topic of riots and rope swings. I skirt further still around the story of Jimbo and us and the new girl who tore up our calm, or the good that snuck up on us in the dark. I don't mention crosses, either burning or strung up by the neck in a church. I don't mention Mecca or Jesus, or why just yesterday driving the Pike. When Daniel Shore on NPR said Sri Lanka, I let go the wheel and made a map with my hands, just like I have now for 25 years, every time I hear that country's name spoken. They all, these men who buy me dinner at Legals, once read O'Connor and Tennessee Williams and Faulkner at Harvard. That was years ago now, back before their first marriages. But it's clear they've looked ever since for misfits and Snopeses and Stellas, for lovely, loose women who smell of magnolias. I don't line out for these men or for anyone else why my adult life takes place a good 1,000 miles from the only place I'll ever call home, or how no manner of grace, a word Jimbo used, can undo what gets done. I don't say this either, that my home is a beautiful place, a terribly beautiful place that gives birth to traitors and cowards and heroes, sometimes all in one skin. And I never say why, because I don't know. I long like I do to go back. You know, they say you can't go home again, ever. Can't relive the past. And until this morning, I would have said that was true. But something about the face in the garden got me to wonder if maybe time does have its back stitches and snags, like the physics professors all drone on about, though no one believes them. Maybe some parts of your past don't stay just where you thought your life left them, all shredded in pieces. This morning, I wondered, nearly knocked to my knees with the scent of espresso and pine needles and peanuts and sweat all at the same time. I wondered if maybe there's some other end to my story still to get made. Thanks for asking. Fi?
As I recall, when I read the novel, one of the things I was so intrigued about was how you wrote about language. As a young girl, you're trying to talk the way your mother talks. And, or this character is, trying to talk the way her mother talks. Trying to say something that might be truthful, maybe unkind, in very nice language. How did you know to write about that? How did you know to point to that?
Growing up with that Southern culture that sometimes prioritizes niceness over kindness, if we're going to talk about the kindness that is also the justice of God. And having to come to terms, I guess, with that, especially living in Boston, realizing it makes for a pleasant society when to go buy your milk at the convenience store, the person is just phony and nice instead of being honest and crabby. They just kind of, and realizing there's a place for a certain amount of phoniness that just sort of makes life pleasant, and we all pretend. And then there's something deeply dangerous about prioritizing niceness in a way that is frightened to meet ugliness and injustice head on, if niceness is the primary goal. But I wanted to try to make three-dimensional characters because I certainly, my life is filled with people who are sweet and might sound to an ear who's not used to Southern, might sound like they're going to be phony, and they will stand up for the good and the just and the. But we all know, what Martin Luther King Jr. said about far more dangerous than the Klan were the nice people who kept quiet. And that's been something that I think through my adult life has kept ringing in my ears of wanting to make sure that I'm noticing the times in my life when I'm being nice instead of kind in the right ways. So anyway, thanks for asking. Any other questions? I do so love to hear stories from other people who are writers or keepers of stories. One time when Marty was down at Baylor for a conference, a big conference of art and soul, perhaps. But I remember sitting at a table and sort of trading some family stories. And when I told one of mine, one of the stories that came back was a young woman who had just been to help her great uncle, had just died and had been to help the family clean out the closet. And back in the back of the closet was Klan attire that his own wife didn't know was there. And the kind of horror that generated in the family, especially among the younger generation. And but just the stories that that we can all share, and it's just a great gift to get to hear. If any of you are in creative writing or any kind of writing classes or literature classes, that moment when someone reads in the class, especially that moment when someone who's never read their writing aloud before, have you been a part of that moment before, and they had no idea what a gift they had, that moment when everyone in the class freezes. And it's just one of those beautiful, where you just feel like a writer was just born, and for that person to be affirmed that they have this beautiful gift that maybe no one had a chance to affirm before because they were too shy or too whatever it was but I know that happens a lot in communities like this, where there's a high level of trust and a high level of academic brilliance going on, and a priority for what's important, what is life's purpose. And that's always, to me, an environment that especially engenders really good stories, asking those kind of big questions. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for letting me join you guys tonight.
Thank you so much, Joy. And I really enjoyed hearing you read. It's great. Thank you all for coming. There are bookmarks at your place for future readings coming up, and also the surveys at your table. Don't forget those. Our next event this year is scheduled for the new year, January 31st, 2013, and features essayist and nonfiction writer Katie Fallon from West West Virginia University. So we look forward to seeing you back then, and do bring your friends. Thank you.